Let's play a game.
Most poker players think they know what to do in tough spots, but do they really? Today, we're putting your poker IQ to the test. I'm throwing you into real hands from pre-flop to the river, and you're going to have to make the best decision at every step. Keep track of your score, because by the end, you'll know if you're playing at a really high level or if you've got some serious leaks to fix. I'd bet less than 1% of players get a perfect score. You ready? Let's jump in. All right, so we're gonna start off with pre-flop here, and hand number 1, a fish opens in the cutoff to 20, and we are on the button here with pocket sixes. There are 2 solid regs here in the small blind and big blind. So question number 1 in this spot, do we fold, call, or 3-bet to $60? Take 5 seconds and make your decision. In this spot, we should be 3-betting to $60. We have a fish who opens. We want to play pots heads up in position against players we're going to have a skill edge on. A live fish is going to under 4-bet, so they're just going to let us realize our equity. They're really only going to 4-bet with the top of their range, which means we're going to get to see a flop a high percentage of the time. We're essentially shutting out the 2 players who know what's going on here at the table, the regs in the blinds, and we're just getting heads up with a player we're going to have a skill edge on in position, which is an A+ 10 out of 10 situation for us. All right, next situation, a low jack player who is on the more passive side opens to 25, and this player does have a limping range, which means sometimes you'll see him limp with some of his weaker or middling hands from up front. Now he opens 5x to 25. We're next to act in the hijack here, and unless otherwise noted, we're starting off all these hands 200 big blinds or $1,000 deep in a 2-5 game. So we're in the hijack with 9-8 of hearts here. Should we fold, call, or 3-bet to $75? So in this spot, I would actually be folding with 8-9 of hearts, because this player from the low jack has a limping range, which means when they open from up front, they are just going to have too strong of a range, particularly when they open to a 5x size. So we see here in an extreme scenario, if a player is only opening 7.5% of hands, which is a very, very tight range, this should be our continue range from the hijack here, because this player is opening such a strong range, right? They're just limping with all of the middle and the bottom of their range. So when they open, particularly from 5x from up front, they just have a super strong range. And you see here, this is extreme. This would be if they're opening top 7.5% of hands. But even if they're opening, say, 15% of hands, we still want to be extremely, extremely tight with our 3-betting, because their open range is extremely, extremely tight. And not only do we have to worry about them having a strong range, we have to worry about one of the players behind us waking up with a top 3 or 5% hand. So you see here, 8-9 of hearts, not even close. 8-9 suited should just be folded pre-flop against a player who has a limping range and is now opening from up front. All right, next hand here, and this one, the low jack is going to open to 20. Once again, 2-5, 1,000 effective with the whole table here. The cutoff is going to call, button's going to call, and it is around to us in the big blind with 7-6 of spades here. In this spot, should we fold, call, or 3-bet squeeze to $120? So in this particular spot, I think our hand is too good to fold a direct suited connector, and I would just be calling. I would not be squeezing here in this spot, because when one player opens and then there is a field caller or multiple field callers, we are just very, very likely to see a flop, even if we 3-bet here. So we want to choose a linear range when we're squeezing here, which just means good, better, best. This hand does not fall into that category. Let me show you. So at 200 big blinds, when squeezing against a relatively tight open from the low jack, we would want our range to look something like this. You see, it is all those hands in the upper left corner of the hand balloon chart. It's just our good hands, right? Ace queen off plus, all of our suited broadways, pocket 8s plus. It is just going to be good, good, good hands. You see, we're just never squeezing with 7-6 suited, 6-5 suited, ace 4 suited, etc., right? It doesn't make sense to squeeze with a hand like ace 4 suited or ace 5 suited if our opponents are just going to be calling with hands like ace 8 suited and ace 9 suited. We want to squeeze with hands that are going to be able to dominate our opponent's calling range, because when there is an open and then when there is a call in the field, we are just very unlikely to get it through. We're very likely to see a flop playing out of position. So we want just good hands that can dominate our opponents. So with 7-6 of spades here, I would be inclined just to call. This one, a good reg opens in the low jack here. We're in the hijack next to act with pocket 10s. And notice the rest of the table is fish, right? We've got a fish in the cutoff button, small blind and big blind, all fish behind us. And the one good reg at the table has opened in the low jack. So in this spot, do we fold, call, or 3-bet to $60? All right, so in this particular spot, I would actually be calling here when a good reg opens, particularly from early position. I want to be playing a polar range, meaning I'm going to be 3-betting the very, very best hands here that can cooler the reg when he opens, hands like kings, aces, ace, king suited, etc. And then the hands that are going to be at the bottom of my continue range. The general crux of this strategy is we want to play pots with the players who are going to make the biggest mistakes. So we want to let the fish in the pot because these are the guys who are going to be making the 100, 200 big blind mistakes. Probably not the reg who's opening a tight range from the low jack, right? So we just don't want to be 3-bet ISOing the regs nearly as much as we would the fish. We want to let the fish in the pot. So my continue range versus a reg low jack open with all fish behind might look something like this. You see we're 3-betting the very, very top of our range, aces, ace, king suited, pocket kings, and then the bottom of our continue range, which actually looks pretty tight because this is a low jack versus hijack configuration. So our worst suited broadways, king jack, queen jack, jack 10 suited, maybe an ace 5 suited. So you see here the middle of our range, the queens, jacks, tens, king queen suited, ace queen suited. The middle of our range is just going to be a flat from a reg open when there are all fish behind. We are incentivized to let the fish into the pot. And just for an A-B comparison, this would maybe be my range when a reg opens in the cutoff and we are on the button and we've got 2 fish in the blinds. You see this range gets much wider. The top of our range gets wider for value. We're now 3-betting queens, jacks, ace queen suited all the time. And the bottom of our range sinks down a couple notches too, right? Now we're just 3-betting maybe the 9x hands, the suited connectors, the worst suited ace-x hands. And now we're just calling with a bunch of those hands in the middle. King, queen suited, queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited, pocket 9s, 8s, etc. All those pocket pairs, right? The later the configuration gets, the wider the top of our range and the wider the bottom of our range gets. But the general MO stays the same. When a reg opens, when there are fish behind, we generally are incentive to play a polarized rather than a linear range. All right, moving along with our pre-flop test. Now a reg opens in the cutoff and a fish calls on the button, and we are in the big blind with pocket 9s. So in this spot, do we fold, call, or 3-bet squeeze to $100? So in this spot, even though a reg opened, I would still be squeezing to $100. Once somebody opens and then somebody calls or multiple players call, I don't care if the player who opened is a reg, a fish, a whale, whatever. Once there is a bunch of dead money in the pot, the fish already put his money in the pot. We're not shutting out fish behind us, right? At this point, I would just be squeezing. And when we squeeze, we just want to be going linear, linear, linear. This hand falls into that category, good, better, best, maybe squeezing hands like pocket 8s plus here, all of our suited broadways, all of our good suited ace X, etc. Right? Just our very good hands. 9s falls into that category. I would be squeezing in this spot all the time. All right, next hand here, and we open ace queen of diamonds in the cutoff, and a solid reg is going to 3-bet us to $60 on the button, back around to us. And in this spot, do we fold, call, or put in the 4-bet to $200? So in this spot against an aggressive reg who is capable of 3-betting relatively wide on the button, I would almost always be putting in the 4-bet in this situation against a capable player. When we are 200 big blinds deep and out of position, we want to be 4-betting a linear range because when our opponent 3-bets hands like ace jack suited or ace 10 suited or king queen suited, they are going to be doing quite a bit of calling when they are in position. So once again, when our opponent's doing a lot of calling, we want hands that can just out pip them. And ace queen suited would certainly fall into that category. So we see here 200 big blind solved range here against an aggressive opponent when we're out of position. Just want to be 4-betting very, very linear. Queens, kings, aces in there all the time. Ace king in there all the time. Ace queen suited in there all the time. And then just working in a sprinkling of pretty much all of our good hands. 9s plus our good suited broadways, our good suited ace X. You see we're just choosing our good, better, and best hands when we're 4-betting from out of position. All right, final pre-flop hand here. So make sure you get this one right. Folds around to us on the button. We open with pocket jacks to $20, a good reg in the small blind. 3-bets to 80. It is back to us. And in this situation, do we fold, call, or 4-bet to $180? In this situation, 200 big blinds deep, I would just be calling when our opponent 3-bets out of the small blind. When we are in position after our opponent 3-bets, we just want to be 4-betting polar. We don't want to be 4-betting linear when we are in position against a capable opponent, because what's going to happen when we 4-bet? Well, our opponent from out of position isn't going to be doing nearly as much calling as they would from in position. Our opponent is just going to jam a lot. They're just going to fold a lot. When our opponents aren't going to be doing a lot of calling, we want to be playing a more polarized range, and jacks is kind of a little bit in between there. Here's a pretty close approximation of how I would play my range, button versus small blind, when the small blind 3-bets. You see, we're 4-betting the very, very top of our range, kings, aces, ace, king suited, and then sometimes queens and ace, king. And then we get in there with some 4-bet bluffs, the ace 8, ace 7, ace 6, king 9 suited, 8, 7 suited, stuff like that, mainly coming from the ace X and king X hands, kind of blocking our opponent having the top of their range. You see, the whole middle of our range just calls. Jacks, 10s, 9s, queen jack suited, king queen suited. All the middle of our range now is just calling, because we don't really have incentive to put in another bet. We want to be doing a lot of calling because we're in position. We are going to have the positional advantage. And if we 4-bet here, we're just assuming that our opponent's probably not doing a ton of calling when they are out of position. We want to be doing quite a bit of calling, which means we're not going to be going linear. So we will be going polar in this particular scenario. All right, so wrapping up pre-flop, that was 7 questions. Is that 7? Yes, I think that is 7. We are now moving on to the flop, so keep track of your score. All right, still, unless otherwise noted, we're playing 2-5, 200 big blinds effective. So this one we're going to open on the button with pocket 9s. Villain's going to call in the big blind. Flop comes jack 9 deuce. What do you know? And our opponent checks it over to us. So in this situation here on the flop, should we check, bet $20, or bet $40? In this situation as a pre-flop raiser, I would almost always be choosing the $20 size, because I want to choose a size where our opponent is going to raise their strong stuff and still call with their weak stuff. Now, if we go $20 when the board is this wet and dynamic, if our opponent does have a super strong hand, like pocket deuces, jack 9 of hearts, right? If they have a super strong hand, they're gonna put in more money for us. They'll check raise to $60 or $80, and we'll get that big bet from the strong portion of their range. And by choosing this very small size, we also get value from the parts of the range that are essentially drawing dead here. Hands like pocket 6s, pocket 5s, ace queen, ace 10, hands like that would just never call if we potted it. So by choosing this smaller size, we get value from the stronger portions of the range, so we'll put in more money for us, and we get value from the weak parts of the range. So I would go with the $20 bet. All right, next hand here, we open pocket 8s from the cutoff. Villain's going to call on the button, and the flop comes queen 8-4. So we flop middle set here. And in this situation, against the typical live opponent, should we check, bet $20, or bet $40? Against the typical live poker player in this spot, they are going to overstep, particularly because this board is wet and dynamic, and they're going to telegraph their hand strength with their bet sizing. I would just be checking my entire range here. All right, so this one is a 2-part question. So that was part 1, now part 2. We check it over to our opponent, and now our opponent bets $40, pretty big stab. With pocket 8s here, should we call, raise to 150, or raise to 300? So in this spot, I would raise to 300. When our opponent stabs $40 on this board, they are just saying, hey,
I really like my hand.
that means we don't have much fold equity. So I think our opponents are just going to be pretty inelastic here if they have hands like ace queen, if they have hands like ace X of hearts, if they have hands like jack 10 or 10-9 or 4X of hearts. I think with most of our opponent's range that stabs this size, remember, against live players, they are not going to be balanced when they choose a big size, particularly on a wet dynamic board. It just means they have good hands that they aren't planning on folding. So let's just pile in a lot of money right now, and then we can play a 2-street game. I think it would be a pretty big mistake here to check raise the typical 3 or 4X size when our opponent is telegraphing. They're screaming from the top of the roofs, hey, I love my hand. So we beat almost every single hand that they love. Why would we put in a small check raise? Let's just pile in money and try to play for stacks on the turn. All right, next hand here, a multi-way spot. So we're gonna open with pocket queens at the cutoff. The button, small blind, and big blind are all going to call. Now it's going to check around to us here on a jack 9 deuce flop. In this particular situation, should we check, bet $30, or bet $80? In this spot, I would actually be betting, and I choose the $30 size. My reason for betting is I don't think this board is very, very likely to get stabbed. Now, if we were heads up with one player in position, I think it's very likely to get stabbed because players just monkey stab when they have pocket 6s or 9x or pocket 8s or whatever. But when there's just one player in position behind us and the pot is 4 ways, players just don't monkey stab nearly as much when the pot is 4 ways and there's only one player in position to us. So I just don't think this flop is likely to get stabbed. Now, why would I go $30 instead of $80? Well, I'd still like to choose the size here that our opponents are going to be enticed to call with their weak stuff and raise their strong stuff. And when it's multi-way, sometimes we have to choose a smaller size, maybe less than half pot, maybe closer to 1/3 pot, because our opponents are a little bit less likely to fast play their strong stuff, particularly if they're next to act, like the button or the small blind here when there's players left behind them. They're less likely to fast play, and they're less likely to call with their weak stuff when there's other players left behind them. So I would just size down when I am multi-way to ensure that both of those things still occur at a high frequency. All right, next flop spot, we open with pocket 7s on the button. Villain in the big blind is going to call, and flop comes ace 7 deuce. In this particular spot, should we check back, bet $20, or bet $60? So here I'd be betting $60. I'd actually go with the overbet on this board. These are the boards I deviate, these static kind of ace high boards, because if we choose a $20 bet here, our opponent is probably not going to raise their strong stuff or call with their weak stuff. The board is dry, it is static. If our opponent has a hand like pocket deuces or ace deuce suited, they are much more likely to slow play when the board is this static and dry. And on top of that, if our opponent just has weak stuff like king jack or pocket 6s or pocket 4s or something like that, even if we choose a small size on this ace high board, our opponent doesn't really put us on many draws. They always put us on a hand like ace king. So they're probably not going to float with their weak stuff. They're probably not going to raise their strong stuff at nearly a high enough frequency. So on this board, I just generally choose an overbet or check strategy. In the overbet size, I'm just choosing my very, very good hands, my massive draws, which we don't have any draws on this board, or our hands with very good blocking properties, blocking our opponent having super strong hands like sets or 2 pair. In this particular spot with pocket 7s, I just want to pile in money. I don't think our opponent is ever folding an ace here, and I'd like to maximize value against the ace X portion of the range, which is going to be inelastic, at least on the flop. We're at next flop spot. We open pocket 9s in the cutoff, and the villain on the button calls. Notice in this hand, we're starting off a little bit shorter. We are only 400 effective to start this hand here, and the flop comes ace 9 deuce rainbow. So we flop middle set here, and in this situation, should we check, bet $25, or bet $50? In this spot, I'd actually just come out and bet $50 here. So why would I just come out and bet 50? Number one, the board type and board texture. These static dry boards are the boards that are least likely to be stabbed compared to the wet dynamic boards like Jack 9 deuce with a flush draw. So our opponent's still going to overstab relative to equilibrium, but they're just not going to overstab nearly as much as they would on a wet dynamic board. Number two, the biggest thing here is the stack depth, right? Our opponent only starts his hand 400 effective, and we just don't need to go for a check raise to pile in all the money, right? We're not really worried about bad turn and river cards. We're not really worried about a flush coming in where our opponent would fold top pair or something like that. We're not really worried about maximizing value from their big draws, right? We could just go bet, 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 and very easily get the money in. And the best way to minimize fold equity is just to bet ourselves instead of going for a check raise. The reason we go for check raises is because we often want to play a 2-street game and pile in money before the nuts change. But on this board, we don't really have to worry about that. We can just go bet flop, bet turn, bet river, very easily get the money in with reasonable turn and river sizes, and we don't need to go for that check raise in order to accomplish that goal. Next hand here, we open Jack 10 of spades on the button. Villain in the big blind is going to call, and flop comes ace 8 deuce with a couple of spades. And when our opponent checks it over to us, should we check back, bet $20, or bet $60? So here I would actually be checking back, and let me explain why. On these ace high static boards, I'm playing an overbet or check strategy. The hands that I'm using for the overbet size are my very, very strong hands. Maybe ace king plus, my 2 pair, my sets, those would be my overbets for value. And the hands that I want to use as my overbet bluffs, either my massive, massive draws, where if they check raise, I have a very easy decision to call. And there are hands with very good blocking properties. Maybe a hand like king deuce of diamonds, blocking our opponent having pocket deuces, ace deuce suited. So I'd want to choose choose the hands where if we get check raised here, we have a very easy decision, just a very easy fold or a very easy call. This hand, if we get check raised after we overbet, we are kind of in a pickle, right? Because we could be up against 2 pair or sets, which I guess we're doing okay against, but we also could just be up against ace X of spades. So this hand for me, when we're playing this overbet or check strategy, would just work better as a check back here. And on this board, my overbets would be maybe some ace X of spades hands, and then my ace king plus, 2 pair sets, and maybe some deuce X hands, blocking my opponent having those 2 pair and sets. Next hand, we open pocket 7s in the cutoff. Our opponent calls on the button. Notice we're starting this hand 500 effective, so only 100 big blinds to start this hand. And now the flop comes 10, 7, 5. We flop middle set. So in this spot, should we check, bet $20, or bet $50? So in this spot, I would actually be checking, and this spot's different from the ace 9 deuce spot earlier where our opponent was shallow and he flopped middle set where we could just go bet, bet, bet. Because this board is wet and dynamic, this board's going to get stabbed a lot more often than the ace 9 deuce rainbow example. And because the board is wet and dynamic, by checking here, it just gives us the option to possibly play a 1 or 2 street game if our opponent stabs before a straightening card or a flushing card or something like that comes in that would kind of force our opponent to fold their good hands. So I would check. All right, 2-part question. We do check, and now our opponent stabs for $20, so a small size here on a wet dynamic board. So when our opponent stabs small with middle set, should we call, raise to $80, or raise to $150? This one is a little bit tricky. I would actually still raise the big size to 150 here. And you may be thinking,
Well, Mark, when our opponent stabs small, don't they just have a weaker range?
well, yes, they do. Our opponent just doesn't have as much strong 10x or pocket 5s or super strong hands on this board when they choose a small size. But the thing is, if our opponent's just monkey stabbing with a hand like pocket 6s or pocket 8s or ace 4 of spades, right? If we check raise to any size, they're going to fold those hands. And when our opponent stabs small, it doesn't always mean that they have a weak hand. It just means that their range is a little bit weaker. Might our opponent sometimes stab small if they have a hand like 8-9 here, or 6-8, or a king high club draw, even an ace high club draw? Just because our opponent stabs small, we can probably chop off a lot of their pocket 5s, their ace 10, king 10, stuff like that. But they could still have draws when they take this small size that are going to be inelastic. And by choosing this big size here, it allows us just to play a really clean 2-street game where we can just jam most turns, get the money in, and play for stacks against our opponent's stronger draws that are just going to be inelastic and not want to fold. All right, next hand, another multi-way spot. In this one, the low jack limps, and we're gonna ISO on the button to $30. Now the small blind, big blind, and the limper come along, jack 9 deuce. What do you know? We flop middle pair here. It checks around to us on the button. And in this spot, should we check back, bet $40, or bet $120? So here, multi-way, I would almost always be checking back. When we are multi-way, it is just much more likely we are up against a strong hand somewhere. If this pot was heads up, right, I would just be betting my entire range because our opponents are gonna play poorly against a range bet. But when we have 3, 4, 5 players in the pot, we need to be a little bit more picky about our c-betting. And I'm just going to be c-betting our thick value and our very strong draws here in the spot, kind of our equity-driven portion of our range when we have 3 other players in the pot. Ace 9 does not fall into that category, kind of a showdown value-y hand when we are 4 ways here. So I would just be checking back and seeing what transpires on the turn. All right, the final hand of the flop part of the poker test here. So in this hand, we have king 5 of diamonds. We open on the button. Villain's gonna defend in the big blind. Flop comes ace 9 5. And in this particular spot, should we check back, bet $20, or bet $60? So once again, on these ace high kind of static boards, I am playing an overbet or check strategy. When we are 200 big blinds deep, this is the perfect hand to put into our overbet bluff size here on the flop, because on these boards, our opponents just aren't going to fast play pocket 5s, ace 5 suited, pocket 9s nearly as much. When we have a hand like king 5, makes it way less likely that our opponent has 5s or ace 5, and also makes it less likely that our opponent has ace king, which live opponents will sometimes flat, particularly from out of position pre-flop. So this hand just has some really nice blocking properties. Don't like to go too overboard with the block, blockers because I think they're misapplied and people just rely on them too much in live poker where it really doesn't matter. But this is one of the spots where our opponent just won't really fast play their strong stuff, where having those blocking properties is really nice. So I would just start off with an overbet here on the flop, targeting our opponent's ace X. That's always going to call the flop, call the turn, and then fold the river. Then we can get a lot of folds from hands like ace 4, ace 10, even like ace jack here. If we go big bet, jam on this board, just really hard for our opponent to put us on draws, and having that king in our hand, having that 5 in our hand, really nice candidate to run that bluff. All right, so now we are done with the flop. That was 9 questions. Now we're going to move on to the turn. 7 turn questions coming right up. All right, so first hand here on the turn, we open 7-6 of diamonds on the button. Our opponent calls in the big blind, queen 8-4. We are just going to be range betting here, choosing the size where our opponents raise their strong stuff, call with their weak stuff. We go 20, our opponent calls, go to a turn, which is an offsuit deuce. And when our opponent checks it over to us on the turn here, do we check this one back, bet $30, or bet $120? So on this turn, I would be choosing the $120 sizing because I think our opponent is capped, but they still have some inelastic hands in their range. So when we bet small on the flop and when our opponent just calls, they're generally going to raise off their pocket 8s, queen 8 suited, pocket 4s on the flop. So the best hands they have getting to this turn are going to be a lot of one pair hands like ace queen, king queen, but it doesn't mean those hands are going to be folding right now. So I would choose this very large size here on the turn because even though our opponent is capped, they don't have the strong stuff that's going to put in more money for us, but it doesn't mean they're folding now. So with our bluffs here on this turn, we want to be piling in as much money as possible. Just because they are inelastic on the turn does not mean they're going to be inelastic on the river. On a lot of rivers, if they brick, all their flush draws and straight draws fold. And the queen X on a lot of rivers is really going to start getting squeamish and not want to play for all the money when we start 200 big blinds effective. So on this turn, I would be overbetting. Next hand, we open ace 5 of hearts from the cutoff. Button calls, flop comes 8-5 deuce. And in this spot on a wet dynamic board, I'm just checking my entire range at this stack depth to a typical live player. So we check, our opponent goes 30. We've got middle pair with top kicker here. So even to a big stab, I'd probably be calling here because yes, when our opponent chooses a size, they have a little bit of a stronger range, but we got middle pair, we can approve. So we're gonna call. We go to a turn, which is a 4 here. And so we pick up a gutter to go along with middle pair. We check it over to our opponent. And now our opponent goes 80 into 107 on this turn. Do we fold, call, or check raise to $240? So in this spot, I would just be folding, even though we do pick up some equity here. I think in this spot, we are drawing pretty thin. First of all, we have a couple clues here. Number 1, our opponent chose a big size on the flop. Live opponents in particular tend to under double barrel massively, right? They overstab on the flop and then they under double barrel turns and under triple barrel rivers. He is just screaming. He really likes his hand. Live players are just going to be massively under bluffing here. And even though we pick up equity, I'd say we're drawing very thin. We are almost always behind in the spot. So I would just pitch this card into the muck and give up right now. Next hand on the turn, we open ace queen of diamonds on the button. Villain's going to call in the big blind. Flop comes 9-8-3. I'm just choosing the size on this wet dynamic board where our opponents call with their weak stuff, raise their strong stuff, usually around half pot here. So I go 20 and our opponent calls. We go to a turn, which is a 4 of diamonds, giving us a nuts. And when our opponent checks over to us in this spot, should we check back, bet $30, or bet $120? So here I'd be choosing the small size, the $30 size. And the reason why is because on this turn, our opponent is once again uncapped. Most live opponents play flops way too passively. They under check raise, particularly with their draws and semi bluffs. So getting to this turn, our opponent is going to have quite a lot of flushes himself. And the really nice part of betting 30 here when we get to this turn is our opponent is going to put in more money for us. They're going to check raise when they have a king high, 10 high, jack high flush here on this turn. And also by betting 30, our opponent is now going to continue with a bunch of hands that we have drawing dead. By choosing this small size here on the turn, we incentivize our opponents to raise with their strong stuff, which they have because the nuts have changed on this turn, and we incentivize them to continue with their weak stuff that we have drawing dead. Next hand here, we open pocket 4s. Opponent calls on the button. Flop comes 7-4 deuce, so we flop middle set again on a wet dynamic board. I'm just checking my entire range out of position to the typical live opponent, so we check. Our opponent goes $30. When our opponent chooses a pretty big size on this board, 60% plus pot here, just assuming that they've got a pretty strong range that they just don't want to fold many of those hands. So we're gonna put in the big boy check raise. We go $300 here. Our opponent calls. Now the turn is a 7, giving us a boat here. And on this turn, should we check, bet $200, or jam all in for $680? So I'd actually go for the very small size here, $200. And my reasoning behind this is I really don't want our opponents to fold a hand like ace X of clubs that we have drawing dead. And also by betting $200, if our opponent does have a 7, they'll probably just put the money in for us. And if they do have an overpair, a hand like 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks, for this $200 size, they're just not going to fold when the board pairs. If we jam all in here, if we choose the big size, our opponent will just start folding the hands that we have drawing dead. They're opening straight draws or flush draws, which is a disaster for us. They may call, they may fold with their overpairs. It's a mix, but if we go 200, they just always call with their overpairs, in my opinion. Why not check here in this spot? I think when we check raise a flop, particularly for a large size, if we check it over to our opponents, they're probably just going to check back and realize with their flush draws, with their straight draws, sometimes even their overpairs here, they're going to be pretty cautious about stabbing after we take that huge check raise size on the flop. So I think the best way to get value here is to choose a very, very small size here on the turn. They'll put the money in for us when they have trips, and they'll continue with their draws that we have drawing dead and all their overpairs that we have drawing very, very thin. Next hand, we open ace king of hearts on the button. Our opponent calls in the big blind. Flop comes king 9-3, just going with the half pot size here on the flop where they raise their strong stuff, call it their weak stuff. And our opponent actually puts in a raise here. We've got top pair. We're beating some of our opponent's draws, but we're drawing pretty thinly against their 2 pair and their sets. So I'm just going to call here, see what transpires on the turn. The turn is a pretty good card for us. Deuce of hearts giving us the nuts. And now our opponent checks. So in this spot, once our opponent has check raised the flop and now checked the turn to us and we have the nuts, should we check back, bet $70 or bet $250? So in this spot, I'd actually be going for the very, very big size, $250, and here's why. Our opponent is capped in this spot. I do not believe that they have flushes. Opponents are going to be more passive with their flush draws. They don't just raise off their flush draws willy-nilly. They tend to play those a little bit too passively. What type of player will raise their flush draws on the flop? More aggressive players. When the flush gets there on the turn, is an aggressive player now the type of player who's going to slow down and check when they get there? Probably not. So we can just rule out flushes. Now, could they have a flush at a very small frequency? Okay, sure. But the majority of their range, both from aggressive players and passive players, when they check raise a flop and then check the turn when the flush comes in, is going to be hands like 2 pair and sets. Hands like pocket 9s, pocket 3s, king 9 suited. So even if we choose a small size here, those hands are just never raising in a million years. They're kind of checking for pot control. They're afraid of the flush when we call the check raise on the flop and now the flush comes in on the turn. So in this spot, our opponent is capped, but they are also inelastic. They're just not folding even though they checked here. I'd be going with the big size here. We want to set up less than a 1 SPR on the river if possible. So that way it's going to be really hard for our opponent to get away from their sets. Pile in the money now when they are not putting in more money for us. Next hand, we open 8-7 of spades from the cutoff button calls. Flop comes 10-7-3, wet dynamic flop, just checking my entire range. We check and our opponent stabs small here. So we've got middle pair, no real reason to turn this hand into a bluff. We've got sufficient showdown value against our opponent's range of stabs small here on the flop. So we are going to call. Now the turn is a 7. So we make trips here on this turn after our opponent stabs small. So on this turn, planning ahead, are we going to go for a check call, a check raise, or should we just lead ourselves for $80? So on this turn, I would actually just lead. And the reason why I would lead has a lot to do with our opponent's stab size on the flop. When our opponent chooses a $20 stab, a small stab on the flop on a wet dynamic board, their range is just going to be weak. Live opponents don't value bet thinly enough and they don't double barrel as a bluff nearly enough. So if our opponent has a hand like 8-9 for a straight draw, has a hand like a king high, jack high flush draw, a lot of the time here after they stab on the flop, they'll just check back and try to realize. And when they choose that small size, it's just not going to consist of a lot of 10x. It's going to be weaker hands, maybe some draws, maybe some hands like pocket 8s, pocket 9s, stuff like that. So I would just come out and lead here because I'm not expecting our opponent to double barrel at a high frequency. And when we lead, we're going to minimize fold equity. I don't expect our opponent to fold hands like flush draws or straight draws when we check call and come out and lead on the turn here. And I don't expect our opponent to fold hands like pocket 8s or pocket 9s for 1 bet when we just come out and lead on the turn. Now, if our opponent stab big on the flop, I'd probably be checking again, going for that big boy check raise against the strong portion of their range. But when they stab small, their range is weaker, so I would just put the money in for them. Next hand, we open on the button with king 9 of spades. Opponent calls in the big blind. Flop comes king 9-3, so we flop 2 pair this time. We are going to c-bet half pot, size with a raise or strong stuff, call it the weak stuff. Now our opponent puts in a check raise here. We are going to just call, and the turn is a 9, giving us top full house now. And now our opponent checks it over to us. Should we check back, bet $70, or bet $250? So this is a little bit different when we made the flush on the turn before, and I would actually go small here. I would go $70. So let's think about our opponent's range here when they check raise the flop and check the turn when the board pairs. This is a lot different than when the flush comes in. First of all, our opponents don't check raise flush draws nearly enough. Second of all, they check raise their value, their two pair and their sets way too often. So our opponent's range is just weighted towards two pair and sets to check raise the flop. Getting to this turn, they're just gonna have pocket threes a whole hell of a lot. Why might they check pocket threes? Well, because now their hand is invulnerable. They have nothing to fear. They don't have to worry about flush draws, straight draws, bad cards coming in. When our opponents feel invulnerable, that's sometimes when they trap. That's sometimes when they slow play. So they could have a hand like pocket threes. Also could just have some of the draws here. Yes, our opponents don't check raise the draws enough, but they could have king X of hearts, jack 10, queen 10, queen jack of hearts, right? So they could have some combo draws here. So in this spot, our opponent's actually uncapped. They can have pocket threes a high percentage of the time. And also when the board pairs, we don't want to choose that huge size and get our opponents to fold hands that we have drawing dead or drawing very, very thin, like king X of hearts or their combo draws. So we want to choose a small size here to entice those hands to call. And if they have pocket threes, well, we're going to get in all the money against that hand anyway. We don't really have to go with a big bet because either our opponent's going to just check raise and put in more money for us now, or they'll just lead the river or check raise the river. We're going to get in all the money if our opponent has a boat. So let's make sure we maximize value against our opponent's draws, which are going to be elastic here on this turn when the board pairs. See how differently this spot is than when the flush comes in on the turn. All right, so that was 7 questions on the turn. We're moving on to the river. We're going to have 7 questions with 2 bonuses for a total of 9 points on the river. So hopefully you're keeping track. Let's move on to the final part of the test, the river. All right, first river question. We open pocket fives, big blind calls. Gonna choose a size where they raise strong stuff, call with their weak stuff on the flop. So we go 20, our opponent calls, we go to a turn, and our opponent is capped, but they're going to have some inelastic hands. They're gonna have hands like ace X of diamonds, ace queen, 4X of diamonds, hands that just aren't folding even for a big size, although they're never going to put in more money for us. So we're gonna choose the big size here on this turn. We go to a river, which is a queen, giving us a full house now. Pot is 322. We've got 840 behind on this river. So should we bet $200, $350, or go with the all-in overbet size $840? On this river, I would just be jamming, going $840, the all-in big boy size for value, because I think most of our opponent's range getting to this river is either going to be bricked draws or queen X. If I had a bluff in this spot, if I had a hand like 7-6 of spades, I would feel very, very uncomfortable going all in for all the money. I just don't think our opponents are folding queen X ever. So that means when we have value in this spot, we don't think our opponents are ever going to fold trips. So I would just go all in with pocket fives. Next hand, a solid raise opens on the button. We're going to defend in the big blind with ace jack. Flop comes king jack 4. We flop middle pair. Our opponent bets 20. We're going to call. Turn is now a 6 of diamonds. Our opponent goes with a pot size bet, and we're going to call once again with middle pair. Now we get to the river. We're going to check, and our opponent goes 180 into 242 on this river. So once again, we are playing against a solid reg who triple barrels in the spot. So should we fold, call, or raise all in? So on this river against a reg, against a pro, I would actually be calling here on this river. Regs are going to be much more capable of bluffing than fish or Rex, particularly in wide configurations, right? We've got button versus big blind. That's about as wide as it gets. On double Broadway boards, because they're just going to c-bet the range on the flops. They're gonna have too many hands getting to the turn. There's a lot of natural bluffs in there, right? The queen 10, the 10-9, the ace 10. So regs in general going to overbluff wide configurations, double Broadway boards, single raise pots where we give them rope, and when all the money doesn't go in on the river, right? All the money doesn't go in, still a reasonable size on this river, not all that scary. So this is a spot where I think live regs or good players could be over bluffing. So I'm just going to get a little bit sticky here and call with our bluff catcher. Next hand, we open 7-6 of spades. Villain calls in the big blind, king 9-5. We're just c-betting half pot. Our opponent calls. We get to the turn. Our opponent is capped here, but they're going to have inelastic hands. So we are going to overbet. Our opponent puts in the call. Get to the river, which is an offsuit deuce. Our opponent checks it over. And on this river, should we check back, bet $200, or all in $840? And on this river, I would just be going all in with the big boy overbet bluff size. I would ask myself in this question, if I did have a hand like pocket aces or ace king, well, I'd be targeting hands like king queen, king jack, king 10. I don't think our opponent is going to call a 2.5x, 3x pot overbet on this river if they have a hand like king jack or king 10. So with value here, I'd to be going in the vicinity of 350, 400 if we're a little greedy here. What does that mean when we're bluffing? If we think our opponent is folding king jack, king queen, king 10, if we just put the money in here a high percentage of the time, well, we have a very, very, very profitable all-in bluff spot. We see here this a little bit different from the hand we saw before where there was a board pairing card on the river, giving our opponent a lot of trips. Our opponent's just not really going to have hands better than one pair here at a high frequency. So we're just going to put in all the money and go for the range fold. Next hand, we are playing against a 2-5 reg. Again, in this one, we open red aces. Our opponent is going to call in the big blind. Jack 7 deuce, we just c-bet small here. Our opponent puts in a check raise, and maybe he could be doing this with worse for value, some bluffs here, some gut shots. So we are going to call. Turn is a 4 of hearts, and now our opponent chooses a relatively small size, 100 into 162. Can still have the best hand here some of the time. Our opponent could also still have some of those straight draws, maybe some hands that picked up a backdoor to go along with it. 10-9 of hearts, 8-9 of hearts, 10-8 of hearts, stuff like that. So we are going to call once again. Now the river is the 10 of hearts, and our opponent comes out and bets 160 here on this river. Should we fold, call, or raise all in? On this river, I would be raising all in. When our opponent chooses this size on the river, I think they are running out of bluffs, right? We talked about those hands that check raise the flop and then double barrel the turn. It's just gonna be a lot of those like gut shots or straight draws or backdoor flush draws. The flush gets there on the river. The gut shots either make a pair or get there on the river. Our opponent in this spot is just really not bluffing. I think we can rule out calling right away, and folding seems like a reasonable option, but let's consider this for 1 second. If our opponent did have a hand like Jack X of hearts, is this a line they would take? Well, probably not. Maybe the king jack of hearts, queen jack of hearts, those hands just get 3-bet pre-flop at some frequency from a solid reg, and they don't really get check raised all that much on the flop in the first place. Also, if our opponent did have a hand like 8-9 of hearts, is he going to check raise the flop all the time? Probably not. Is he going to double barrel the turn after he check raises the flop when he picks up equity? Well, yeah, sure, probably. But is this a size that 8-9 of hearts is going to use on the river, or might it get a little bit greedier? So I just think when our opponent chooses this size, even regs, even live pros are going to be unbalanced here. When they back into a backdoor flush, they're generally just going to choose a bigger size, and they just don't really have any bluffs that take this line. So most of our opponent's range is going to be hands like pocket sevens, pocket deuces, jack 7 suited, and against a reg, remember, this is not a fish. Against a reg, how is a reg going to be feeling? We call a check raise on the flop. We call his turn barrel. The flush and the straight gets there on the river. Now he bets, and now we jam over the top. We just look so strong here. If I put myself in that reg shoes, I would fold pocket sevens, pocket deuces, jack 7 all the time, and we just don't think our opponent has a flush. We don't think our opponent has a straight all that often on this river. So if we think we can get our opponent to fold sevens and deuces here all the time, I would just be turning our bluff catcher into a bluff for the most profitable play on this river. Now, bonus question. Let's say we get to this river in the same way with a hand like ace jack of hearts, right? So our opponent check raises the flop, barrel the turn, and now bets on the river. What should we do with ace jack of hearts? Should we raise to $350, raise to $600, or raise to $820? So I'd be raising small. I'd be raising to 350. I think we can rule out the 820 right away. That's a size we were going to choose as a bluff. I think if we raise to 820, our opponent just folds hands like sevens and deuces and jack 7 all the time, right? That's why the bluff was so good. So we want to ensure that our opponent's going to call with those hands. So in the spot, very hard for us to be bluffing from an aware player's perspective. So I would just choose a very, very small size, give them a good price, and hope they get curious with a hand like pocket sevens, pocket deuces, jack 7 for a very good price if we just click this to 350 on this river. All right, next we have ace queen of spades on the button. Opponent calls in the big blind. Queen 4 deuce with a couple of spades. Pretty good flop for us. We're just gonna c-bet half pot. Opponent calls. Turn is a 6. On this turn, our opponent is uncapped, so we're gonna choose a small size, get them to raise off their flushes, get them to call with their weak stuff that we have drawing dead. So we go small, and our opponent just calls. We go to a river, which is the innocuous 8 of diamonds. Our opponent checks it over to us once again. Do we bet $100, $250, or $420? So here, I'd be going with a small size, $100, because I think our opponent is capped and their range is going to be quite elastic. Remember, we bet small on the flop, where our opponent would raise their 4s, their deuces, their 4 deuce suited, queen 4 suited at a high frequency. Then we bet small on the turn, where our opponents would raise their flushes at a high frequency. Now, getting to this river, most of our opponent's range is going to be weak, right? It's going to be queen X type hands, maybe a hand like pocket 9s with a spade. Our opponent's range is going to be weak. So if we want our opponent to call, we can't just pile in money just because we have a good hand if we want to make more money. We need to choose a reasonable size, taking into account our opponent's range on this river. So if I'm trying to get a hand like queen jack, king queen, something like that to call on this river, the flush has gotten there, the obvious draw has gotten there, I believe we need to size down here. I would just go $100 trying to get king queen, queen jack, queen 10 to call here on this river. Second to last hand, this one we have ace jack of clubs, a recreational player 3 bets on the button. This is a rec, not a rig. We are going to call ace 9 deuce. We check it over. Our opponent bets big here on this flop, but we've got top pair. We're calling. Now on the turn, there is a backdoor flush draw to go along with a front door flush draw. Our opponent double barrels. Well, there's lots of draws out there, so let's see what transpires. We're going to call once again with top pair. We get to the river, which is a deuce pairing the board. We check it over. Our opponent bets $600 all in on this river. Options here in this spot. Do we fold, call, or take our pants off, swing them around our head, and roll around on the table pantsless? While the pants option is tempting, I would actually fold in the spot. Lots of context clues here. Number one, our opponent 3-bet. They chose a big size on the flop. When our opponent chooses the big size, they're just going to have a stronger range. They double barreled on the turn. Our opponent's under double barrel in live poker, particularly as a bluff. Now on this river, they are putting in a big chunky bet here on the river, 600 into 800. Opponent's under triple barrel. We don't beat any value. Ace high boards are under bluffed. It's a big size for the game. So because our opponent is under bluffing and our hand does not beat value, our hand is just a bluff catcher. And if our opponent is under bluffing, every bluff catcher is more profitable as a fold than as a call. Final hand here. This one, our opponent opens in the cutoff to 20. We're going to 3-bet on the button with 7-6 of hearts. And our opponent, a live recreational player, is going to call. Flop comes 9-4 deuce in a 3-bet pot, just range betting, just like I would in a single raise pot, but choosing a smaller size because the absolute size of the pot is bigger. So I want to choose a smaller size to entice our opponent to call with their weak stuff, raise their strong stuff. So I go 50 here. Our opponent calls. Turn is a king. And when our opponent checks it over, I'm going to choose a small size here on this turn because I would hate for our opponent to fold hands like pocket 10s, pocket jacks, pocket queens, hands like 9x. And if we start going too big, our opponent's range getting to the river is just going to be hands like ace king, the occasional slow played set, and maybe a big combo draw like ace 3 or ace 5 of spades. By going too big on this turn, we just funnel our opponent to the river with a very, very strong range. We'd like to keep in a lot of the weaker hands to make our river bluffing range more profitable. So we are going to go small on this turn. Our opponent calls. We get to a river, which is an ace, and now our opponent checks it over. So our options on this river are going to be to check back, to bet $120 for a small bluff, or to bet $810 for the big boy bluff. I would actually be choosing the small size here on this river, $120. We funneled our opponent to the river with a weak range, and it's not going to take that much money here to get our opponents to fold hands like pocket 10s, pocket queens. On this ace X river, our opponent's going to be very elastic with a lot of those hands that we allowed to get to the river in this way, so we can just get a very cheap price on our bluff here. No real reason to go all in and isolate ourselves against a part of our opponent's range that's just ace king, ace 9 suited, ace 4 of spades, right? No real reason to choose the big size. Let's be efficient. Just get those hands like 10s, jacks, queens to fold here. Bonus and final question. Now on this river, we get here with pocket kings and our opponent checks it over. Now our options with pocket kings are to either bet $120, $400 for just over the size of the pot, or all in for $810. And with pocket kings on this river, I would be going all in. Why would I be going all in? Because I think our opponent just has some very strong hands that are just never folding. Hands like ace 4 of spades, ace deuce of spades, ace 9 suited, maybe even a hand like ace king. I think our opponent's range getting to this river is just going to have some brick walls. I would just like to maximize value against that portion of our opponent's range. Now our opponent's just never calling in a million years, no matter what size we choose, if they have a hand like 9x, 10s, jacks, queens. So let's just maximize the value against the top of our opponent's range. Now there may be a case for sizing down, targeting the ace X of spades, but I think the ace X of spades may call a jam sometimes anyway, but I think our opponent's going to have a ton of 2 pair in their range. I think those hands are never folding. I think the ace X of spades maybe sometimes gets curious and calls a jam some percentage of the time. I would be going all in with pocket kings. All right, so let's add up your points here. If you got somewhere between 30 to 34, you are a crusher in Ind Boss. 24 to 29, solid reg. Pretty good winning player for sure. 18 to 23, trying recreational player. You're trying, maybe break even, maybe a small winner, but you're getting there. And somewhere between 10 to 17, smells a little bit fishy. And if you got 0 to 9, we're talking about a beluga, a massive whale. Maybe need to go back and work on some of this poker stuff. All right, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this poker IQ test and it turns you into the biggest boy possible. Thank you and have a gentle